the chamber in prayer.
Thank you, Mr. President. God our Father, we thank you for all that you have done for this chamber and our nation. As we give praises for both the blessings and challenges in the past year, we receive your presence and guidance for the year that is ahead of us. Lord, we submit the needs of our country before you. Give us a yearning to always move forward as we carry on our service to your people. Bestow upon us courage and humility so that we may be united in contributing to the progress of our nation as we glorify you in all that we do. Taglay ang bagong pag-asa ngayong bagong taon. Patnubayan niyo po kami sa aming gawain. Sa pamamagitan ng inyong biyayang kaalaman, naway maipadama namin sa mamamayan ang inyong pagkalinga. All these we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. The Senate choir will lead us in singing the Philippine National Anthem. Secretary, please call the roll.
The Honorable Senators Angara, Aquino, Binay, De Lima, Drilon, Ejercito, Escudero, Gatchalian, Gordon, Honasan, Monteveros, Lacson, Ligarda, Pacquiao, Pangilinan, Po, Recto, Soto, Trillanes, Villanueva, Villar, Soberi, the Senate President, Pimentel.
With 16 senators present, the chair declares the presence of a quorum.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I move that we dispense with the reading of the journal of the 42nd session, Wednesday, December 13, and consider the same as approved.
Is there any objection that we first of all greet our Senate President pro tempore a happy birthday?
Oh, yes.
So session is suspended. Ano yung motion niya? Dispense with the reading. Dispense with the reading. I consider the same as approved. Session is resumed.
Mr. President, may I call for a previous question?
Sorry for that digression. The pending motion, my dear colleagues, is that we dispense with the reading of the journal of the 42nd session, Wednesday, December 13, 2017, and consider the same as approved. Any objection? Hearing none, the motion is approved.
Mr. President, I move that we proceed with the reference of business.
Is there any objection? There being none, the motion is approved.
50.
Secretary, please conduct the reference of business.
Messages from the House of Representatives. Letters from the House of Representatives informing the Senate that on 11 December 2017, it ratified the Conference Committee report on the disagreeing votes of the following House bills. 5211, an act renewing for another 25 years the franchise granted to Gateway UHF Television Broadcasting Inc., presently known as Gateway Television Broadcasting Inc., and doing business under the name and style of Hope Channel Philippines, amending for the purpose Republic Act Number 7223, entitled an act granting Gateway UHF Television Broadcasting Inc. a franchise to construct, install, operate, and maintain for commercial purposes UHF television broadcasting stations in the Philippines and for other purposes. 5176, an act renewing for another 25 years the franchise granted to Saraga Integrated and Management Corporation under Republic Act Number 7478, entitled an act granting the Saraga Integrated Management Corporation of the Philippines a franchise to construct, install, operate, and maintain for commercial purposes radio and television broadcasting stations in the Philippines and for other purposes. 5212, an act renewing for another 25 years the franchise granted to Filipinas Broadcasting Association, Inc., presently known as World Broadcasting Corporation, and the Republic Act Number 7485, entitled an act granting Filipinas Broadcasting Association, Inc., a franchise to construct, operate, and maintain for commercial purposes radio broadcasting and television stations in the Visayas and Mindanao and for other purposes. 5063, an act granting the Pangasinan Gulf Waves Network Corporation a franchise to construct, install, establish, operate, and maintain radio and television broadcasting stations throughout the Philippines. 4636, an act granting the Iloilo Baptist Church, Inc., a franchise to construct, install, establish, operate, and maintain radio and television broadcasting stations in the Philippines. 5177, an act renewing for another 25 years the franchise granted to Infocom Communications Network, Inc., presently known as Now Telecom Company, Inc., under Republic Act Number 7301, entitled an act granting Infocom Communications Network, Inc., a franchise to construct, establish, operate, and maintain mobile radio systems such as radio paging systems, cellular phone systems, personal communication network, and trunked radio systems within and without the Philippines for a period of 25 years and for other purposes as amended by Republic Act Number 7940. 5064, an act renewing for another 25 years the franchise granted to Subic Broadcasting Corporation and the Republic Act Number 7511, entitled an act granting the Subic Broadcasting Corporation a franchise to construct, install, operate, and maintain radio and television broadcasting station in the Philippines and for other purposes. 5175, an act renewing for another 25 years the franchise granted to Beta Broadcasting System, Inc., under Republic Act Number 8026, entitled an act granting the Beta Broadcasting System Corporation a franchise to construct, operate, and maintain radio broadcasting stations in the island of Luzon and for other purposes.
To the archives.
Letter from the House of Representatives informing the Senate that on 12 December 2017 it concurred with the Senate amendments to House Bill number 5235, entitled an act establishing a National Science High School in the city of Lawag, province of Ilocos Norte, to be known as Lawag City National Science High School, and appropriating funds therefore.
To the archives.
Letter from the House of Representatives informing the Senate that on 13 December 2017, it ratified the Conference Committee report on the disagreeing votes on House Bill number 6215, entitled An Act Appropriating Funds for the Operation of the Government of the Republic of the Philippines from January 1 to December 31, 2018, and for other purposes.
To the archives.
Committee report number 218, prepared and submitted jointly by the Committees on Public Services, Civil Service, Government Reorganization and Professional Regulation, Education, Arts and Culture, and Finance, on Senate Bill number 1637, with Senators Poe, Ejercito, Pimentel III, De Lima, Soto III, Escudero, and Ligada as authors thereof, entitled An Act Creating a National Transportation Safety Board, prescribing its powers and functions and appropriating funds, therefore recommending its approval, in substitution of Senate Bill numbers 162 and 1375, taking into consideration proposed Senate Resolution numbers 190, 301, and 314, and the privileged speech of Senator Vicente C. Soto III on road accident delivered on February 21, 2017 by Senator Poe.
To the calendar for ordinary business.
Additional reference of business. Message of the President of the Philippines. Letter of President Rodrigo Roa Duterte, dated 8 December 2017, submitting for the Senate's consideration and concurrence the free trade agreement between the EFTA, European Free Trade Association, states, and the Philippines, which was signed on 28 April 2016.
Referred to the Committee on Foreign Relations.
Proposed Senate Resolution number 576, entitled Resolution Commending the Outstanding Young Men of 2017, Senator Maria Lourdes Nancy Binay.
To the Committee on Rules.
Communications. Letter from the Office of the Senate of the Philippines, transmitting to the Senate two original copies of Republic Act number 10963, entitled An Act Amending Sections 5, 6, 24, 25, 27, 31, 32, 33, 34, 51, 52, 56, 57, 58, 74, 79, 84, 86, 90, 91, 97, 99, 100, 101, 106, 107, 108, 109, 110, 112, 114, 116, 127, 128, 129, 145, 148, 149, 151, 155, 171, 174, 193, 194, 195, 196, 197, 232, 236, 237, 249, 254, 264, 269, and 288, creating new sections 51-A, 148-A, 150-A, 150-B, 237-A, 264-A, 264-B, and 265-A, and repealing sections 35, 62, and 89, all under Republic Act number 8424, otherwise known as the National Internal Revenue Code of 1998 as amended, and for other purposes, or the Tax Reform for Acceleration and Inclusion, which was signed by President Rodrigo Roa Duterte, accompanied by a direct veto of 6 line items.
To the archives.
Letter from the Secretary Salvador C. Medialdia, dated 19 December 2017, transmitting to Congress through the Senate, Republic Act number 10964, or the fiscal year 2017 General Appropriations Act, duly signed by the President, and the President's Budget Action Message.
To the archives.
Second additional reference of business, bills on first reading, 1638, entitled An Act to Strengthen the Office of the Ombudsman, by establishing a retirement benefit system for the Ombudsman, her deputies, the Special Prosecutor, and other officials and employees performing legal, prosecution, investigation, and corruption prevention functions, augmenting employees' benefits, appropriating funds therefore and for other purposes. Senator Lacson.
To the Committees on Justice and Human Rights, Civil Service, Government Reorganization and Professional Regulation, and Finance.
1639, an act amending Republic Act number 8762, otherwise known as the Retail Trade Liberalization Act, and for other purposes. Senator Win Gatchalian.
To the Committee on Trade, Commerce, and Entrepreneurship.
1640, an act declaring May 3 of every year a special non-working holiday in the municipality of Santa Cruz, province of Marinduque, in commemoration of its founding anniversary to be known as Santa Cruz Day. Senator Win Gatchalian.
To the Committee on Local Government.
1643, an act promoting consumer protection and fostering competition in the telecommunications industry by prohibiting the locking of mobile wireless devices to a public telecommunications entity. Senator Win Gatchalian.
To the Committee on Trade, Commerce, and Entrepreneurship.
1644, an act promoting open access in data transmission, providing additional powers to the National Telecommunications Commission and for other purposes. Senator Win Gatchalian.
To the Committees on Science and Technology and Public Services.
Resolutions. PS Resolution number 577, resolution directing the Senate Committee on Games and Amusement to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the controversies currently surrounding the Philippine Charity Sweepstakes Office, with the end in view of improving current legislative efforts to revise the charter of PCSO and likewise enact appropriate legislation to put a cap on the amount spent by government agencies, offices, and instrumentalities, including government-owned or controlled corporations, in parties and other office celebrations. Senator Lacson.
To the Committees on Government, Corporations, and Public Enterprises, and Games and Amusement.
PS number 578, resolution urging the appropriate committee to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on further increasing the ability of the country to ensure that the status and position of public officers and government employees are not being misused or abused for personal gain, and that the integrity of government posts and the discharge of a government agency's mandate and operations are shielded from improper influence and interference from personalities with vested interests and dubious reputations by looking into the application and implementation of current laws, including the Civil Service Law and the Code of Conduct and Ethical Standards for Public Officials and Employees, and of other related laws, to the revelations coming out of the internal squabble at the Philippine Charity Sweepstakes Office. Senator Laila de Lima.
To the Committee on Civil Service, Government Reorganization, and Professional Regulation.
PS Resolution number 579, a resolution directing the appropriate Senate Committee to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the release of the Malampaya funds by the Department of Budget and Management without complete documentary requirements, in violation of existing laws and rules and regulations as specified in the Commission on Audits Special Report number 2017-04. Senator Win Gatchalian.
To the Committees on Finance and Energy.
Committee reports. Committee Report 219, prepared and submitted jointly by the Committees on Civil Service, Government Reorganization and Professional Regulation, and Finance, on Senate Bill number 1641 with Senator Trillanes IV and Ligarda as authors thereof, entitled An Act Regulating the Practice of Fisheries Profession in the Philippines, creating for the purpose a professional regulatory board of fisheries and appropriating funds therefore, recommending its approval in substitution of Senate Bill number 619, Senator Trillanes IV.
To the calendar for ordinary business.
Committee report number 220 and prepared and submitted jointly by the Committees on Civil Service, Governmental Reorganization and Professional Regulation and Finance. On Senate Bill number 1642 with Senators Poe, Trillanes IV, Legarda as authors thereof, entitled An Act Institutionalizing the Implementation of the Government Internship Program, providing funds for its implementation and for other purposes, recommending its approval in substitution of Senate Bill number 345, Senator Trillanes IV.
To the calendar for ordinary business.
Third additional reference of business, resolution. Peace Resolution number 580, resolution calling for the Constitution of the Senate of the Philippines into a Constituent Assembly to propose amendments to or revision of the Constitution, and upon approval of 3/4 vote of its members adopt the same. Senator Lacson.
To the Committee on Constitutional Amendments and Revision of Codes.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
may I manifest that if the author agrees, may I be made co-author of PS Resolution 580, and the manifestation contains also the intention of Senator Greg Honasan to be a co-author.
There's being no objection from the principal author, the said senators are named as co-authors.
You recognize Senator Subiri, Mr. President.
Senator Subiri is recognized.
Yes, Mr. President, with the permission of Senator Ping Lacson, if I could be made also a co-author of his said resolution on the Constituent Assembly. Thank you, Mr. President.
With Senator Poe.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd also like to manifest the same, to be co-author of the resolution for a constitutional 580, the Constitutional Assembly, by Senator Lacson. Thank you.
Senator Gordon.
Mr. President, I filed a resolution earlier on last year on Constituent Assembly formation on the issue of economic reforms. I firmly believe that if we're going to amend the Constitution, Mr. President, it must be for legitimate reasons. And it must be based on the fact that there must be a prioritization in this country of the issues we want to tackle when we change the Constitution. Mr. President, I just want to find out what has happened to that resolution that we filed so far as the amendment of the of constituting the Congress as a Constituent Assembly to handle economic reforms, Mr. President.
If that is a parliamentary inquiry, Mr. President, may we ask the Minority Leader to respond?
Yes, Mr. President, with the permission of the Majority Leader, we were chairing the Committee on Constitutional Amendments before the reorganization of the committees in the chamber. And one of those resolutions that was on the table that we were discussing was precisely the resolution of Senator Gordon. If I recall correctly, the resolution was calling for a constitutional convention.
Constituent Assembly, Mr. President.
Constituent Assembly to discuss the economic provisions, among others. Anyway, we did conduct 2 hearings and included in the agenda the resolution of Senator Gordon. The first question that we put on the floor on the committee hearing was, is there a need to amend the Constitution? If there is such a need, do we go through CONCON or CONAS and proceed from there? On the second hearing, Mr. President, we asked the Executive Secretary to be present in order to get on the record the views of the Office of the President. When Secretary Mijaldea appeared in the hearing, he manifested that the Office of the President has signed an executive order creating a committee to study the proposed amendments which will be submitted to the committee. And on that last hearing, the Secretary Medialdea said, we had the executive order just signed today. There will be, if I recall correctly, 25 members of the committee to propose, to study and propose amendments to the Constitution. That was the last we heard, Mr. President. That is on record, and no proposal has been submitted by Malacanang until the reorganization came of the committees. We understand that up to now, there is no submission on the part of the Office of the President, but the new chair of the committee, Senator Pangilinan, has set the hearings on Wednesday, this coming Wednesday.
Mr. President, I just wanted to raise that because if we have to have a change in our constitutional convention, in our constitution, this representation, being a former member of the Constitutional Convention in 1971, has taken a position that the best way to do so would be the Constituent Assembly. Of course, that is only my opinion, Mr. President. And that we should tarry a little before we tinker around with the Constitution because it's the fundamental law of the land. And that if we're going to submit proposals in the Constituent Assembly, this must be discussed with our people. And that if any submissions are going to be made, we go into the issue of whether we want to revise or amend certain provisions of the Constitution. This representation firmly believes that we should adapt what has happened in other countries like the United States, where they have amendments piecemeal. That means the Constitution is owned by the people because the burden of understanding the provisions is not as heavy as has been the constitutional history of this country. When we changed the Constitution in 1971, it became practically a commission that was going all sorts of places. So much so that when martial law was imposed, Mr. Marcos practically took over the Constitution. He had already declared martial law at the time. And as you all know, there are many cases in the Supreme Court. They said that when the Constitution was ratified, there were jokes that, sino gusto kumain, tinaasa yung kamay, at na-ratify na po yung Constitution. I mean, of course, I'm exaggerating a bit, but there were instances like that. And I felt that very few people really understood what the Constitution was all about. And then again, in 1986 or 87, when the Constitution was again revised, or rather amended, overhauled by the revolutionary government of President Aquino. Again, Constitutional Commission members were appointed instead of elected. Again, we tinkered around with the Constitution. I remember I was with Senator Enrile, the late Senator Cayetano, and Senator Tadad, and we went all over the country and we opposed the approval of that Constitution because we figured that the people were not part of the process at that time. Again, that is only our opinion. Of course, we were defeated, but at least we tried. Now, Mr. President, before we even go into amending this Constitution now, we suggest that I hope that we could all sit together as a body where we will agree on whether we really want to amend. There is need to amend the Constitution first and foremost. Is there a need for it? I mean, there are so many priorities in this country right now, Mr. President, that has to be attended to. There is many situations like what is happening in Marawi, many disasters that cry to heaven for assistance insofar as surcease on the part of the suffering of our people, Mr. President. And therefore, Mr. President, it's important that I have to come in and give a few thoughts on this matter, if we can tarry a little, because quite frankly, I'm confused right now whether I would support the resolution of Senator Lacson, because if I'm to be asked, am I in favor of a Constituent Assembly as a way of amending the Constitution, I certainly am. But if you ask me, Mr. President, may I call for order?
We move to adjourn the other session.
Yes, Mr. President, I don't want to...
Can we ask for silence, please? as senators are debating on the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Go ahead, sir.
Mr. President, like I pointed out, I'm in a quandary as to whether I would support it. Obviously, on principle, I'm in favor of the Constituent Assembly as a way of amending it. But at the same time, I would like to get the Senate's views on whether there is need to really amend the Constitution. The statements in the country today, the airlanes are filled with fast and furious statements on the Constitution. In fact, right now, there is the matter of now constitutional members of a commission have been formed. I don't know if that's an animal that is approved by the Constitution. As far when I studied law, Mr. President, it was not. Obviously, it's going to be an advisory system, Mr. President. But again, in principle, I would like to ask our friends here in the body if we can address this in a, a solid discussion as to whether there is need to amend the Constitution, put it on the front burner over all the other issues. And remember, Mr. President, there is a forthcoming, if you are to believe the House, they're talking about impeachment. There's talk about federalism that has not been quite adequately discussed. BBL, Mr. President. It's very, very important issues, Mr. President, that we have to really ponder and discuss very well as representatives of the country, Mr. President, in this most august chamber. And certainly, there's also the issue, and I have no doubt, and I say it on all fours, Mr. President, that the Constituent Assembly is the proper way to do it, and that it must be separate, meeting separately and voting jointly, Mr. President.
Voting?
I'm not voting separately, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Mr. President. Like I said, I sometimes, Mr. President, there is noise within the chamber that distracts the mindset of this doddering old man here, Mr. President.
Mr. President, we associate ourselves with the views of the esteemed senator from Zambales. In fact, when we were chairing the committee, that was the first issue that we raised, a prejudicial question. We called for resource persons. The first issue to be tackled was, is there a need to amend the Constitution? We are not assuming that there is a need to amend the Constitution. That is not, we are not proceeding from that assumption. We are proceeding from the assumption that this is a committee hearing. We want to seek the views of everybody. That's why I described it, and I'm glad that the present chairman, Senator Pangilinan, has adopted the same tack as now the good senator from Zambales is taking. The first issue is there need to amend?
Yes.
And I assume on Wednesday, the resource persons invited will be asked that basic question, which was not finished when we were chairing the committee. So we associate ourselves fully with the views of the gentleman from Olongapo, and the present chair of the Committee on Constitutional Amendments is listening, and at least he is made aware of the sentiment of the good gentleman and our association with the sentiment of Senator Gordon. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the thoughts expressed here by the good friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, Senator Drilon, who is also a very learned individual here, who has always been very, very much in point on the issues of the day, Mr. President. And so I will look forward to that meeting, Mr. President. Those points, in other words, if we must tarry, let us tarry slowly, and make sure that we do so reflectively, and we do so in the highest interest of the country and not for any other interest, such as extension of terms of congressmen, extensions of terms of presidents, or for that matter, because it has no place, Mr. President, in the discussion. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Senator Pangilinan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would just wish to confirm the earlier manifestation of the former chairman of the Constitutional Amendments Committee and now Minority Leader, Senator Drilon, that we have scheduled a hearing of the Constitutional Amendments Committee on Wednesday, 9 a.m. At the Rector Room, if I'm not mistaken. That is this Wednesday, January 17, for the information of our colleagues, Mr. President.
Majority Leader. Sorry, Senator Subiri.
Yes, Mr. President. Mr. President, just to not to create any confusion, because I initially filed a bill, and it's being tackled by the committee on the creation of a constitutional convention. I'm preparing a letter today for the information of the chairman, withdrawing that bill, and instead we will be supporting the Constituent Assembly resolution of Senator Lacson. So within the day, Mr. President, I'll be signing the letter. As a matter of fact, it's in the hands of my staff, and we'll be filing it properly to the rules, as well as the committee of Senator Kiko Pangilinan. Thank you. So that there will be no confusion. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Aquino.
Yes, Mr. President, just on the point of the gentleman from Bukidnon, we actually both filed a resolution for CONCON, no? And my resolution is still in the committee, but I understand, Mr. President, that in the deliberations for going through a constitutional change, this will be part of the points that will be discussed. I'm sure, Mr. President, many of us are open to listening to the experts, listening to each other's points of view on the matter, but I'm hoping that we can discuss that properly in the committee, whether the best way is a CONCON or a CONAS, Mr. President. I know that the first statement of the President was also in favor of a CONCON, then eventually it became a CONAS, and I think many of us have also stated both positions in different times. Hopefully, Mr. President, this can be tackled accordingly, and maybe we can all just keep an open mind when it comes time for the deliberation. But I hope, Mr. President, the possibility of pushing for a CONCON will be deliberated as well as a CONAS, Mr. President. Just one more point.
Senator Pangilinan.
Just one more point, Mr. President, if the majority leader and our colleagues would agree. May we request that the discussions earlier and the transcripts be likewise referred to the Committee on Constitutional Amendments?
We have no objection, Mr. President. We concur. Therefore, we move that all the manifestations after the request for co-authorship be also incorporated into the referral to the Committee on Constitutional Amendments and Revision of Codes and Laws.
Yes. Is there any objection? Hearing none, motion is approved.
Thank you.
And let the records reflect the co-authorship of Senator Subiri and Poe upon the request for PS Resolution number 580.
Thank you, Mr. President. With the permission of the body, I move to transfer from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders Senate Bill 1636 under Committee Report 213.
Is there any objection? Hearing none, approved.
I move to consider Senate Bill 1636 under Committee Report 213.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
May we ask the Secretary to read the title of the measure?
An act requiring public telecommunications entities to provide nationwide mobile number portability to subscribers.
Mr. President, to sponsor the measure, may we ask the Chair of the Committee on Economic Affairs, Senator Win Gatchalian, be recognized.
Senator Gatchalian is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, Mr. President and esteemed colleagues. I'm delighted to sponsor legislation whose time has definitely come, the Lifetime Cell Phone Number Act. It will give you the power as a consumer to carry your cell phone number for life, even if you change service providers. It will also allow you to keep the same cell phone number when switching from your postpaid to a prepaid subscription and vice versa. This is technically called mobile number portability, where your cell phone number is portable in order to give you the freedom to choose the provider that will give you the best value for your money without losing or changing your number. How many of us complain about the very poor service that we are getting from our service providers, and yet we stick to them because we do not want to change numbers? As a result, we continue to pay for bad service, because we do not want the inconvenience of changing numbers, because we fear that we may lose important contacts. With Lifetime Cell Phone Number Act, the shackles are finally off. We can now walk out of our service provider whose services are so poor that we no longer get our money's worth. It will be a much easier decision to transfer to the service provider that offers the best customer service, the best network coverage, and the best quality of service. Sa madaling salita, hindi na po tayo magdadalawang isip na iwanan ang service provider na hindi tumutupad sa mga pangako. Dahil sa Lifetime Cell Phone Number Act, hindi na natin kailangan magtiis dahil madadala na natin ang ating cellphone number kahit lumipat pa tayo sa ibang service provider or kahit magbago tayo ng subscription from prepaid to postpaid o postpaid to prepaid. Indeed, this bill is not about making it easier for consumers to cut the cord from poor and unbearable telco service. It is also an important recognition on how one's cell phone number has become so critical to maintaining one's digital identity, such that when the most awaited third player in the telco industry comes along and proves itself worthy of our money and patronage, we will not choose to stick around and put up with poor service because we do not want to lose our number, which has, to some extent, already become our identity. Mr. President and esteemed colleagues, kung tama man ang sinasabi ng iba na walang forever, para sa akin, mayroon namang lifetime. Dahil sa Lifetime Cellphone Number Act, madadala mo na ang iyong cellphone number for life. Thank you, Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Walang forever, pero meron ano? Walang forever lifetime.
Mr. President, to give time to the members to study the proposed measure, I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill 1636 under Committee Report 213.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
Mr. President, I move to resume consideration of Senate Bill 1532 under Committee Report 142.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
This is the measure on the Innovative Startup Act. The parliamentary status of the measure is that we're in the period of individual amendments, Mr. President. So, considering that this is a substitute bill, I move to recognize the sponsor of the measure, Senator Bam Aquino, Chair of the Committee on Science and Technology, for his individual amendments.
Majority Leader, Senator Aquino is not on the floor, so maybe...
Mr. President, I move to suspend the session for a few minutes.
Session is suspended.
Ready to resume.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, before the break, I asked that Senator Bamakino be recognized. I was just informed that the Department of Science and Technology are not ready with their amendments, their proposed amendments. Therefore, I will have to move for the suspension of the consideration of Senate Bill 1532 under Committee Report 142.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
There are two other measures that Senator Bamakino will be taking up, but at this point we have rescheduled it for tomorrow or Wednesday. It depends on the members of the Senate who will be proposing their individual amendments. So in the meantime, I move to resume consideration of Senate Bill 1531 under Committee Report 141.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
This is the measure on Energy Efficiency and Conservation Act of 2017, Mr. President. This has been languishing in the agenda for a long time. So the parliamentary status of the measure is still in the period of interpellation. So may we recognize the sponsor, Chairman of the Committee on Energy, Senator Gatchalian, and find out from him if there are any other interpellators on the measure.
Senator Gatchalian is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President, and I am open to any questions or queries regarding the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Act, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President, may we recognize the Minority Leader, Senator Frank Leon.
Minority Leader is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Will the gentleman, the sponsor of the measure, yield the floor to a few questions?
Yes, Mr. President, I'll be more than happy to receive some queries, Mr. President.
Before that, can we have the light, sir? We cannot read.
Lights on, please. On. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the first part of our interpellation will be basically based on the questions that Senator Laila de Lima would have propounded if he was allowed to attend our sessions. There is an official letter sent to this representation as Minority Leader, wherein Senator de Lima has requested a clarification from the sponsor on the bill. So with that premise, Mr. President, with the permission of the Chamber, may we pose these questions. Mr. President, under Administrative Order number 110, dated October 25, 2004, the Government Energy Management Program, or GEMP, was created. Now, Senator de Lima wants to find out and place on the record if the Department of Energy has documented the gains under this program. In other words, Senator de Lima wishes to spread into the record the answer to the question if the Government Energy Management Program, or GEMP, has been successful.
Mr. President, thank you, Mr. President, for the question. And let me just pull out slide 6 of my presentation, Mr. President. Mr. President, this information came from the Department of Energy, and for the last almost 10 years, they have documented the gains from this program, but this is purely from the public sector, or all the government offices, Mr. President. So since 2005, Mr. President, the government saved almost 2.3 billion pesos to date, Mr. President. It sounds big, but if you look on a per year basis, Mr. President, it's not actually quite big. No? On the average, the government only saved about 100 million pesos every year. So, Mr. President, this bill, one of the objectives of this bill is to really increase the savings of the public sector by coordinating the different conservation and efficiency programs of the different departments, spearheaded by the Department of Energy, Mr. President. So just to answer the question directly, Mr. President, from 2005 to 2016, the public sector saved about 2.3 billion pesos, Mr. President.
Over a period of 10 years.
Over a period of 10 years, Mr. President.
And would the gentleman consider this a success in terms of government savings?
2 billion, ano? Actually, Mr. President, from my point of view, this is, I don't consider this successful, Mr. President. In fact, about 2 or 3 days ago, the World Bank invited us to an event in which they estimated that government should stand to save 3.5 billion every year, no? Every year. And this is a World Bank estimate only about 2 or 3 days ago furnished to us, Mr. President. So if you take 2016 as an example, Mr. President, the government only saved 61 million pesos from its program. But the World Bank estimated that we can save about 3.5 billion pesos every year. So far cry from the 61 million pesos saved in 2016, Mr. President.
So on that premise, the conclusion is that the government energy management program is a failure.
It's not sufficient, Mr. President, or maybe it's a failure also can be put it that way, Mr. President.
It's the gentleman places on record politically correct statements.
Thank you, Mr. President.
But having said that, is it our understanding that the government energy management program will now be placed under the control of the Interagency Energy Efficiency and Conservation Committee? Is that?
Yes, Mr. President. This concept is actually introduced by Senator Trillanes, this interagency committee, and I subscribe to the idea of Senator Trillanes. Currently, Mr. President, different government agencies will have their own conservation plans and conservation programs. So what this provision intends to do is to consolidate all of those conservation programs, make DOE the accountable head of all of those conservation programs, and make sure that the conservation programs have target, and we record the baseline of those conservation programs, Mr. President. So definitely DOE is the most knowledgeable department when it comes to efficiency and conservation. So we made it we made DOE as the accountable agency when it comes to conservation programs, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That answers my concern that, you know, I have learned in management that the first thing you do is to kill committees because they delay action. But in this particular case, you're saying that the DOE will be held responsible as the lead agency for the program to succeed. Is that correct?
Mr. President, and with the kind indulgence of the gentleman from Iloilo, the Interagency Energy Efficiency and Conservation Committee is only limited to government conservation programs. It will not go beyond the government conservation programs. So, for example, DOE will have their own program, DepEd will have their own program, even the Senate will have our own program here. DOE will now consolidate all of those programs. DOE will also come up with guidelines for all of the different government agencies to implement and to make sure that it's being implemented properly.
Oh, so ang bastonero po, DOE?
DOE po. Dahil, Mr.
And what would be the sanction on a government office which does not adhere to the good intentions and principles and the rules found in the program?
We included, Mr. President, in the bill that DOE has the power to sanction government agency if they don't adhere to the prescribed conservation program.
Can the gentleman spread into the record what are the sanctions that the DOE may impose?
Mr. President, in the bill, we did not specify the sanctions, but we would like DOE to have that flexibility to impose sanctions to the department who is not adhering to the conservation programs, Mr. President.
A little sensitive as a structure. because I cannot imagine that being disciplined by a co-equal or a co-equal official would sit well with the bureaucracy. For example, if the DOE will call upon and call down the Department of Health or the Department of Environment, I do not know how well that will sit with the other secretaries. Couldn't we come up? I agree that there must be, first there must be sanctions, and such sanctions to me must be more specific than general. I do not think that leaving it to the DOE would be effective. As a system, standing here, I could not figure out what is the remedy, but certainly we can see the shortcomings in that system, and we hope that the good sponsor can come up with some system where the compliance with the government energy management program can be more effective than the way it is now crafted.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I acknowledge the observation of the good gentleman from Iloilo that we should have more teeth to be given to DOE when it comes to implementing a conservation plan, and that's actually very relevant, especially when we want to cascade the conservation program to all the different departments and make them accountable. Mr. President, we're open to some suggestion, and we will definitely study how to impose penalties to the other departments, Mr. President.
By the way, just for the record, why are we limiting it to government offices?
Mr. President, that's only for the interagency committee, Mr. President, but the entire bill deals with the private sector, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Now, under the Administrative Order number 110, which is the creation of the Government Energy Management Program, each government entity is supposed to designate a senior official as the Energy Conservation Officer, or ECO. The ECO shall be responsible for his or government or her entity's compliance with the provisions of this administrative order, as well as the development and implementation of the energy efficiency conservation measures. Senator De Lima would wish to the sponsor to spread into the record if indeed this particular provision in the Administrative Order number 110 has been implemented by the Department of Energy, and if so, did the designated Energy Conservation Officer undergo a training prior to their assuming that role, and is there any training manual for the ECOs?
Mr. President, based on our discussion with the Department of Energy, in the beginning when they launched this program, a lot of, or most of the departments complied with assigning a conservation manager officer for this matter. Unfortunately, as the years go by, compliance was very low, and to date, not a lot of the different departments have a compliance officer, and that's actually a problem why we are now seeing that conservation is very low compared to the World Bank estimates. So this bill seeks to strengthen that by making the agencies accountable, and we also specified here in the bill making LGUs also accountable when it comes to conservation and efficiency, Mr. President.
So the implementation of the administrative order, particularly insofar as the conservation officers are concerned, is very lacking.
Very lacking, Mr. President. And again, from the information from DOE, compliance is very low, Mr. President.
All right. Senator De Lima also wishes to know the rationale behind the decision to place the certification program for certified energy conservation officers and the certified energy manager under TESDA rather than the Professional Regulation Commission. Mr. President, in other words, is this because the certified energy conservation officers and the CEM are not licensed professionals?
Let me just pull out slide 11, Mr. President. And we had an extensive discussion on who should be the entity that will certify the certified energy conservation officer and certified energy manager. There was an extensive discussion about this during the hearing. Some suggested that CHED should be the one to certify, but we wanted the certification to be easy and to be as simple as possible. That's why TESDA was empowered to do the certification, because this is not a full 2-year course. We envision this as a short-term training to existing engineers so they can practice energy conservation and efficiency in their own respective entities. So it's not a full-year course. We envision this to be only a few months, about maybe 6 months to a maximum. And we envision this to be taken up by existing engineers in their companies. So they will not employ new engineers, but these are existing engineers in the companies.
All right, yeah. So really, it does not involve creating a pool of licensed professionals. It's
no.
Yeah, because precisely engineers are already licensed professionals, which I think is a good idea, rather than again creating another bureaucracy of energy managers. Yes, I would endorse such a plan.
We took note of this concept, Mr. President, during the discussion of the good gentleman from Iloilo regarding the occupational health and safety proposal here in the floor. And I remember clearly during this discussion, there was a proposal to create new positions for
200 positions.
A few hundred positions for occupational health and safety programs. So we took note of that discussion, and we included that in the in our proposal, of course, guided by the Department of Energy, that this type of responsibility can be just certified. No, they don't need to get they don't need to take a full-blown course. Companies do not need to hire new people. This is an additional knowledge for existing mechanical engineers or electrical engineers to practice. So we will not overburden companies to hire new positions solely for energy conservation and efficiency.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, to the good sponsor. Now, the next question from Senator De Lima is on the matter of the National Energy Efficiency and Conservation Plan, or the NECP. The question is, how long will it take for the DOE to finish the plan? Is there any time frame that is indicated as to when this will be finished? Is there a deadline?
Mr. President, we didn't indicate the time frame. If you go through the bill, the simple concept here is the DOE will now come up with a database of all different equipments, industrial, commercial, equipments that are being used here in our country. They will also have a database of all consumer products here in our country. And this database will actually be used to come up with an national energy efficiency and conservation plan. Definitely the database will take a while to formulate. And we left the time frame for the DOE to come up with that database. The heart and soul of this bill really is to come up with a database of all the equipments and consumer products being sold and being used here in our country.
Section 5. Section 4 or Section 5. When should point out to be Section 5. Can I have 1 minute suspension, Mr. President?
Session suspended.
Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
On Section 5, Mr. Sponsor, there are standards for energy efficiency performance as well as guidelines for its determination that are to be developed by the Department of Energy. The question that Senator De Lima wishes to raise on the record is, will it require a subsequent legislation to give effect to the provisions of Section 5, or in other words, is there a need for legislation, or are we delegating this to the DOE?
Mr. President, the intention is to delegate this to DOE. The intention is to give DOE the flexibility to include the details in the different plans that are specified here in the bill. But Mr. President, let me just mention that the initial reaction of the good gentleman from Iloilo to put a time frame in the national plan, I think that's a good idea, no? Because that sets the baseline for DOE for future updating of the plan. So we will insert in the bill a time frame for the initial national plan, and subsequently DOE can update it using the database, Mr. President.
Yeah. Very good, Mr. President, because that's that would be along the same concept as the economic plans of this government. We have a time frame, and of course we extend it depending on the needs and the events after the plan is crafted. The next question that Senator De Lima wishes to raise is the following. She reads Section 20, Chapter 6, as mandating the CEM and the CECO to manage the energy consumption of the facilities, equipment, and devices. Is this responsibility based on pre-approved plans by the designated establishment? Senator De Lima wishes to know from the sponsor.
Yes, Mr. President. The designated establishments are mandated to submit annual consumption reports to the DOE, but the DOE will also specify the necessary reports, the guidelines, the framework for these designated establishments to submit to DOE. Within the designated establishments, the certified energy conservation officer and the certified energy managers will be the ones physically complying all of these requirements, Mr. President.
And this plan will be initiated by the business establishment?
Yes, by the designated, we call them the designated establishments, Mr. President.
And so presumably, the plan would be realistic because it is crafted by the establishment itself.
Yes, Mr. President. But initially, the DOE will come up with the guidelines and come up with the reports for the designated establishments to comply.
Mm-hmm. And what is the sanction for failure to comply with their own plan?
Mr. President, it will be under Section 31, fines and penalties, and this will be imposed by the Department of Energy, ranging from 10,000 to 1 million pesos, Mr. President.
Oh, okay. The range under Section 31 of the fines and penalties is anywhere from 10,000 pesos to 1 million. Isn't the range too large to give so much discretion to the DOE?
Mr. President, under the bill, there are 3 types of establishments. To simplify it, there are small, medium, and large-scale enterprises, Mr. President. And let me just pull up the slide 14, Mr. President. In slide 14, we identified 3 types of establishments. Type 1. As an example, will be malls, the Senate office, this one, GSIS building. Type 2 will be heavy industries like cement plant and paper plants. Other establishments, these are considered small and medium enterprises such as coffee shops, restaurant, and fast food chains, Mr. President. So we expanded the range because definitely we want to capture or we want to empower DOE to penalize different types of establishments under the law, Mr. President, under the proposal, Mr. President.
Mr. President, just for the education of this representation, can the good sponsor spread into the record and give us a specific example of a conservation program which should emanate from the business establishment itself?
Right. Mr. President, for example, in malls, in shopping malls.
Shopping malls,
Mr. President. In the bill, one of the special features of the bill is to encourage establishments to use technology. In the olden times, when you go to the malls, the escalators continuously move around and continuously operate with or without people stepping on the escalators. But with new technology now, there are motion sensors. So kung wala pong tao, hihinto po yung escalators. No? So those type of technology can be now prescribed by DOE to shopping malls, to business establishments, so they can conserve, Mr. President. I think in the newer malls, they use this type of motion sensor to conserve power and to conserve energy, Mr. President. So this type of technology will be prescribed by the DOE. And also, different practices. For example, DOE will now be empowered to check on the temperature readings inside the malls. So for example, if they prescribe a 22-degree temperature reading and the malls go beyond that or go below that, DOE can penalize them, Mr. President.
Very well-intentioned. And I would concur with the measures the examples of the measures that are contemplated. I'm a little bit concerned, though, about how effective can the committee, Inter-AG committee, or DOE be in enforcing compliance with such good intention measures. Ano ho ba yung penalty dito?
Yeah. Mr. President,
Ito ba
in,
is this the fine? Is it a fine per day? Fine? How will the DOE enforce the well-intentioned measure?
yeah. Mr. President, there are two ways that DOE can enforce. In Section 7 of the bill, the role of local governments, the DOE can seek the assistance of the LGUs in enforcing the conservation proposals of DOEs to different establishments. So since LGUs are entities on the ground, the DOE can tap the LGUs in monitoring and enforcing the prescribed conservation plan.
Can the DOE recommend the revocation of the license to operate of a particular establishment who continues to ignore regulation designed to conserve energy?
No, Mr. President. The DOE can only impose fines, monitor and impose fines on the business establishments, Mr. President. Mr. President, DOE can also impose sanctions and penalties in violation of this bill, Mr. President.
And what are examples of these penalties? Yes. Oh. Okay. Now, I know that Meralco has a program for energy conservation, and the system is an incentive system to encourage you to conserve energy. Is there an incentive system here, or all of these are compliance through a system of penalties?
No, Mr. President. For consumer-related devices, Mr. President, the DOE will be tasked to rate the consumer devices. So, for example, they will buy a refrigerator. The DOE will now certify or rate this refrigerator if this refrigerator complies with the energy efficiency standards that are prescribed by the DOE.
Okay. Now, okay, Senator De Lima likewise raises the following issue. Under Chapter 8, Section 26 on financial assistance, government financial institutions and other financial institutions are mandated to provide concessional financial packages for the deployment, utilization, and commercialization of the energy, of renewable energy and other energy efficiency projects as duly recommended and endorsed by the DOE. The question raised by Senator De Lima is, what are the standards to be followed to qualify the project for endorsement by the DOE?
Before I answer that, Mr. President, let me just pull out slide number 20. And slide number 20 talks about the incentives prescribed under the proposal, Mr. President. There are three types of incentives: the fiscal incentives, incentives under the Omnibus Investment Code for projects in the BOI Investment Priorities Plan. We deliberately made the conservation proposals to be compliant with the BOI so that it will be standardized under one investment regime. And then the non-fiscal incentives, these are awards and recognitions, technical assistance from government, and number 3, financial assistance. And in order to receive financial assistance from government or from government financial institutions, DOE will have to review the equipment being used and the plan proposed by the entities, Mr. President.
Mr. President, we note that under fiscal incentives, it says incentives under the Omnibus Investment Code for projects in the BOI Investment Priorities Plan. Can the gentleman elaborate a bit on what this exactly means? Under what section is this, Mr. President?
Let me just pull out slide 23, Mr. President.
Slide, okay.
Mr. President, with the current tax reform proposal, there were a lot of incentives that were removed to different industries, and we want to make sure that this proposal will not run counter to the incentives that were removed by the tax reform that was discussed, Mr. President. So to incentivize energy conservation and efficiency, we use the Omnibus Investment Code so that it will be in compliance with the current investments or current incentives being given to various industries. I'll give you a very specific example, Mr. President. Assuming I'm a mall and I want to expand my mall and I want to buy a energy efficient air conditioning. So I will now apply to the BOI to get incentives for that particular expansion, and that particular expansion will now be entitled to all of these different incentives under the current Omnibus Investment Code, Mr. President. So the philosophy here being, Mr. President, we are not running counter to the tax reform that was discussed earlier. We just made the conservation investment form part of the Omnibus Investment Code, Mr. President.
Well, Mr. President, in the last few days, we have read about the intention of the administration to submit a second train. The next train is supposed to arrive in Congress in a few days. And the second train is supposed to rationalize the fiscal incentives granted to pioneer industries, etc. Now, the Department of Finance has stated that these fiscal incentives causes a leak of approximately 300 billion pesos, which is, I don't know how many percent of the GDP. And we are aware of the fact that over the past decade and a half, there has been constant efforts to rationalize these incentives because, in fact, it has been abused, because, in fact, it's a leak. And, of course, it is a very difficult piece of legislation because expectedly this will be resisted by the business establishments which are enjoying these incentives. In fact, we only could move a little step by enacting the so-called TINTA, or the Tax Incentive Transparency Act, in order to surface the amount of tax breaks that these industries are enjoying, and put on record what are the benefits that the government would, or the public would get from this incentive granted, specifically if it indeed raises employment, etc. And I would repeat, if I recall the the statements correctly from the Department of Finance, they're saying that these incentives causes a loss of approximately 300 billion pesos. My question, therefore, Mr. President, is how does these proposed incentives incentive system for energy saving how does it sit with the proposed rationalization of fiscal incentive? My initial impression, and we may be wrong, is that these are two concepts which may not be necessarily be parallel to each other. On the one hand, we are trying to rationalize the fiscal incentive so that the same will not be a leak to the revenues of government and allow the incentive only where it is indeed necessary. On the other hand, we are putting up these incentives for energy efficiency, presumably to be able to save on energy. How this is measured, we are still very vague. But just on a policy issue, how does this proposed incentive under the Omnibus Code, how is it consistent with the drive to rationalize the fiscal incentives granted to companies, Mr. President?
Mr. President, just to give the good gentleman from Iloilo a brief history, Mr. President. In the initial part of this bill, there were numerous incentives being proposed by the DOE and also by the industry. And one of the most notorious incentives there was a VAT exemption proposal. No? And we all know VAT exemption is a very touchy subject right now, especially after concluding the talks or the debates in tax reform. Acknowledging that we need to give some incentives to spur conservation and efficiency, especially to those entities who want to expand their businesses and to want to acquire energy conservation and efficient machineries and equipment. So what we did is we looked at the existing laws that are being used to date by government in spurring investments here in our country. And one of the laws that is still being used right now is the Omnibus Investment Code. And the Omnibus Investment Code was never repealed in the tax reform. In fact, it's still being used to spur investment in different industries. So what we did is we aligned the Energy Conservation and Efficiency Bill to the existing Omnibus Investment Code. We will now empower the board of the BOI to include or to assess whether this conservation and efficiency proposals of the different entities will comply with the incentives being given by the Omnibus Investment Code, Mr. President.
So that theoretically the energy conservation program is a new industry by itself, which can be granted incentives by the government.
Yes, Mr. President. Definitely, to catalyze this industry, which is conservation and efficiency, we need to give certain investment to push it forward. But acknowledging the current tax regime, which is to do away with VAT exemptions, with zero-rated VAT, we just harmonized this new industry with the existing Omnibus Investment Codes, which was not repealed in the discussion of tax reform, Mr. President.
May we know, Mr. President, if the views of the Department of Finance were secured on this particular portion of the bill, granting tax incentives for energy programs, and in effect granting pioneer status, if we may call it as such, to the energy-saving industry?
Yes, Mr. President, that was a long discussion during the hearings because the proponents of this bill, the private sector, DOE, were really pushing or lobbying heavily to give VAT exemptions, income tax holidays, and other incentives to propel this conservation and efficiency program. However, we acknowledge that the tax regime now is totally different from before, and we don't want to run counter to the tax reform that is being proposed then by the DOFs. That's why we made sure that this is in harmony with the tax reform that was passed by Congress, and it will be in harmony with the tax regime moving forward. We are not expecting that the Omnibus Investment Code will be repealed. If it will be repealed, the energy conservation proposal will comply with whatever the Omnibus Investment Code in the future.
Okay, so that whatever incentives is granted to energy saving program will be influenced or will be determined by the status of the Omnibus Investments Code now or in the future.
Yes, Mr. President. This is not actually the ideal situation as proposed by the proponents, the private sector and also DOE. But this representation echoed to them that the tax regime now is very different from the previous one. So we have to make sure that it is aligned now and aligned moving forward. And we cannot give away tax exemptions while the other laws are taking away tax exemptions. We have to be in harmony with the current tax regime, Mr. President.
Of course, Mr. President, it will be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to spread into the record now what will be the benefit to the economy, to the environment, and to the finances of the government with these incentives being granted for energy saving programs. Is there anything in the committee hearings or?
Mr. President, we made our own in-house estimates, Mr. President, and let me just pull out slide number 7, Mr. President. And there are two scenarios, Mr. President. If we just focus on year 2018, if this law will be implemented at 50% efficiency, we will reduce our consumption by 274 megawatts, Mr. President.
Nationwide.
Nationwide. And if we are as efficient as Germany, because Germany is the most efficient in terms of energy consumption, we will reduce our demand by 1,125 megawatts, Mr. President. So over the next few years until 2030, Mr. President, we can reduce close to 5,771 megawatts at 50% efficiency and 17,524 at maximum efficiency, which is Germany level. And let me just turn to slide 8, Mr. President. The equivalent in pesos, Mr. President, of those savings at 50% efficiency is about 1.6 trillion pesos up to 2030 and 5.5 trillion pesos to 2030 at Germany level, Mr. President. So optimistically, we're just looking at the red bar, which is about 1.6 trillion pesos to 2030, to year 2030, Mr. President.
Is the assumption correct that where we achieve energy efficiency, we also improve the bottom line of the books of participating companies?
Yes, Mr. President. Energy efficiency means that for the same amount of consumption in electricity, they can produce more, Mr. President. So definitely, when they produce more, they can sell more at the same cost, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President, we have our own set of questions. The questions that we have asked and related questions thereto were raised by Senator De Lima, and we have spread them into the record. We have also our own queries and questions for clarifications. And if the chairman will, or if the sponsor will permit, can we just ask for a suspension for a day or two to allow us to review the questions that we have, as it might have been already covered by the answers of the sponsor. So, with the indulgence of the good sponsor, can we request for a suspension of this interpretation?
Of course, Mr. President, and thank you very much, Mr. President, for the enlightenment. Definitely, we also picked up a lot of things to improve on, Mr. President, and thank you very much to the gentleman from Iloilo, Mr. President.
With that, Mr. President, I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill 1531 under Committee Report 141.
Is there any objection? There being none, consideration of Senate Bill number 1531 under Committee Report 141 is hereby suspended.
Mr. President, the Minority Leader wishes to make a manifestation regarding the Commission on Appointments, Mr. President.
Minority Leader is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. We wish to make of record changes in the contingent of the minority in the Commission on Appointments. This representation will resign as will withdraw as a member of the minority contingent in the Commission on Appointment, and in his stead, we nominate Senator Risa Hontiveros as the new member, effective February 1, 2018. There will be no increase in number, just changes in the representative. So we want to make a record that we are nominating Senator Risa Hontiveros to represent the minority, effective February 1, 2018, in lieu of this representation in the Commission on Appointments. Thank you, Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Yes, we take note, Mr. President, and inform the Commission on Appointments on the manifestation made.
So noted.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Office of Senator Lacson is requesting the change of referral of PS Resolution 577, authored by himself, by Senator Lacson himself, to primarily be referred to the Committee on Games and Amusements, and the original primary referral shall be made the secondary referral of this particular resolution, 577, Mr. President. So moved.
Is there any objection? There being none, the motion is carried.
Mr. President, I move that we adjourn the session until 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Tuesday, January 16, 2018.
Is there any objection? There being none, the session is adjourned until 3 o'clock afternoon of Tuesday, January 16, 2018.